I will tell you guys that how I got to find this little church of yours is I inherited a couple of cats named Bruna and Bertie from a colleague of mine who, a non-Christian who had, excuse me, asked me to look after her cats after she died by an medically assisted death. So got these cats. They did not like my cat. It was awful. So I went to the second option in her letter, which was to contact this guy who was going to find another home for them. And he found a home for them on Gabriola Island with Betty Schramm. And through my correspondence with Philip, one thing at the ends of his messages, he always said, God bless. So I eventually said, hey, are you a Christian? And he said, yes. And then I did a little sleuthing, looked around on the island to find all the churches and found this one, Gabriola Fellowship Church. I thought, well, I bet you that's the church these people are going to. And I contacted Pastor Steve, got the link and attended. And sure enough, there were Betty and, oh gosh, it's Helen. I've forgotten. I'm terribly sorry. And well, Philip's mom and Philip, and they were all there in a square. And I thought, well, wouldn't you know it, eh? So that's how I got to be in this church. And I immediately bonded with this church because I love small fellowships, and it just was a warm and inviting place to be. So thank you for including me in your community and in your fellowship. Steve asked me if I would share. Well, Chris asked me a couple of years ago to share, and I was a big chicken. But then Steve poked me again, and I thought, okay, well, I'll do this. So I'm gonna today. Well, I've already prayed, so I'm just gonna go ahead. This should take about 20 minutes. I'm gonna tell you a bit of my story, and I'm gonna refer to the various times I prayed the sinner's prayer, and I'm gonna illustrate what I did after each of those prayers by using the different types of soil in the parable of the sower. There's quite a bit of imagery in my story, and it's definitely abbreviated, and it covers 33 years of my life. I hope that you will be blessed, and that some of you who are over the age of 70 will be able to see some of the imagery that I am attempting to paint with words. So, excuse me, I was born in 1949 in Regina, Saskatchewan. So I was brought up in the 50s. If you want to picture the 50s, that's wringer washers, clotheslines, black dial telephones with party lines, and black and white televisions with rabbit ears. That should get you back there. We were an average middle-class family, 3 kids. I have an older sister and a younger brother. We were members of Lakeview United Church in Regina, and I went to Sunday school and church services and Explorers and CGIT and summer camp and all that stuff. I've always been a loner, and I still am. Initially, I probably started out my loner life because there were no kids in our neighborhood when we first moved there. Most of the houses were empty. But once I got into school, I still remained a loner. But sometimes I ran into another loner named Naomi Levin, and we would walk home from school together. And Naomi's family was Jewish, but not practicing. And when we were in about grade 3, Naomi invited me to a Bible study. And we went to a bungalow, exactly like the 3-bedroom bungalows we lived in. We sat in a circle on a rug in this lady's dining room, and she told us stories from the Bible. Well, there were no snacks, so it was all business. I remember the stories were vivid and quite serious. We kept attending, and one day the lady asked us if we had given our hearts to Jesus. And we both said no, and she asked if we'd like to receive Jesus' gift of forgiveness for our sin and invite him into our hearts. And we both said yes, of course we would. And she explained about why Jesus died on the cross, and she prayed us through the sinner's prayer. So that was the first time I prayed the sinner's prayer. And I received salvation as a gift from God that day. I had given my life to Jesus and was forever separated from the penalty of sin. I know that happened to me on that day. I was probably about 8 years old. I know that because that's what the Bible tells me. However, Naomi and I decided not to tell our mothers because we thought they might not approve. So in the parable of the sower, that would be the seed falling along the side of the path and the birds coming along and eating it up. So moving along, as a little girl in grade school, I often had a very sad feeling. And in high school, the sadness got worse. So I was a depressed child and I became a depressed teenager. In spite of all that, I was very creative and was always drawing and making things. And I stood out in art class in both grade school and high school. I've got this written down, so I'm turning pages. When I was 16, I graduated from high school. And although my mother wanted me to be a legal secretary and my dad thought I should go into computers, both of those would have been very good ideas, they did let me do what I wanted to do, and I wanted to study art. So because there wasn't any fine arts program at Regina campus at the time, I went off to the University of Manitoba to study fine arts in Winnipeg. I was so depressed at university that I finally went to a counselor on campus, and she explained that I was having a nervous breakdown. That's what depression was called in those days. It was called a nervous breakdown. And there wasn't too much that could be done about it, but she counseled me regularly and I just struggled along. Then in my second year of fine arts, I discovered pottery. And I just loved pottery. I loved the study of form and function and glaze chemistry. It really grabbed me. And so pottery became my thing. And finally, just before I turned 20, I graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts. Well, I went back to Regina. I had always gone back to Regina in the summers and stuff, of course, but I went back to Regina and it was summer. And then I terrorized my poor parents and hitchhiked to Vancouver. Well, Kitsilano was the place to be. And there were these two slightly older hippie guys from Regina who had been to Ottawa to get an opportunities for youth grant from the federal government. And they were rounding up people to populate their project, which they named the Craft Factory. And these guys leased a warehouse on Hamilton Street in what is now Yaletown, and they put us to work. The potters were assigned the top floor of this building, and we put a chimney through the roof and built a gas-fired downdraft. We built shelving, kick wheels, bought a secondhand dough mixer, all the trappings of a real functioning studio potter. And we also opened a store at Denman and Robson in a falling down old shack of a building with a little oil heater in it. And we established this outlet called the Pot Shop. Joni Mitchell came to our pot shop, by the way. We kept our prices low, and we even had a table of free pottery. We were rebels. We threw nothing away. We didn't sign our work, and we called it Pottery for the People. Stuff flew out of there. So about this craft factory, it was quite the place, and lots of hippies and draft dodgers came and went from the craft factory on Hamilton Street. And one day a group of hippies showed up and talked about God. So a girl in the group sat with me, and I told her I was depressed. And she said that Jesus could take away my depression. So we went across the Broad Street Bridge to 4th Avenue and to a house, and there was a tired looking lady in there doing laundry and chores. It must have been some sort of shelter, and I imagine she was a local missionary. Anyway, she sat with me on a sagging sofa and led me through the sinner's prayer. That was the second time I prayed the sinner's prayer. But this time, I told everybody that I had given my heart to Jesus. I just told everybody I knew. I told my family. And this was called confessing Jesus. Well, my hippie boyfriend told me it was a load of baloney. And my family reminded me that I was a member of the United Church. I really tried to be a good Christian, but it only lasted a few weeks, and pretty soon it all just faded away. So in the parable of the sower, that could be the seed that fell on the shallow soil on rocky places where it sprang up quickly, but got scorched by the sun because it had no root. There just wasn't any discipleship around me. It didn't happen yet. So after 2 years, government funding for the craft factory on Hamilton Street ended, but we had become very skilled potters from throwing all those pots and selling them, and throwing and selling and firing and throwing and selling and firing. We did this all day, every day. So we were good at it. And we decided to stick it out and start a new studio for ourselves. So we rented a warehouse in Richmond and established a studio of potters called the Clayworks Society. And after a couple of years in the Clayworks Society, I fell in love with a man who convinced me to leave it all behind and move to Ottawa with him. And he looked more like a 70s businessman than a hippie. If you recall those kind of guys who wore like tweed sports jackets with leather elbows and jeans. And this guy had short hair and penny loafers. So I figured he was a pretty safe bet. But it turned out he was a pot dealer. And he flew back and forth between Vancouver and Ottawa doing his business. Anyway, I was in Ottawa, and shortly after moving to Ottawa with him, things changed very drastically. He became a mule carrying cocaine from Peru to Ottawa for $10,000 a trip. He was up all night, snorting coke and playing backgammon, drinking scotch with his buddies. He didn't want me to do anything but make food and sit around. Well, that wasn't exactly what I had signed up for. And I had no interest at all in staying up all night doing drugs or sitting around doing nothing. I was deeply depressed pretty soon. But I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, defied the boyfriend, and got a job teaching pottery for the city of Ottawa in a couple of recreation centers in Ottawa. But the boyfriend was very, very jealous, and all that coke was making him psychotic. So he became violent. It all happened very fast, and I knew I was in mortal danger. So I pried myself loose, and I fled to Manitoba in my beat up Datsun. I swear that Datsun maybe only had 3 cylinders firing. In Manitoba, I stayed with my sister and her husband for a while. And then I drove my mom from Regina to Victoria in my mom's car so we could pack up my Gram's apartment in Victoria and get my Gram into a rest home. So that got me to Victoria. And I started to build a new life in Victoria. But the jealous boyfriend showed up and destroyed all the new friendships I was making. And finally, I did get away from him by going to Hawaii and not coming back. And I was safe there because he hated hot weather. He definitely gave up. So in Hawaii, I stayed with a woman I had met in Victoria at a ladies' tea party. Now remember, these are the hippie days. This is the early 70s. And a ladies' tea party, was a place where hippie women drank tea laced with Courvoisier and ate hash brownies. Well, I don't know that I was eating the hash brownies, but I guess I must have drunk some of the tea in Courvoisier. Anyway, this woman had invited me to come to Honolulu and stay with her for a while. So I went. That's how I got to Hawaii. I loved being in Hawaii and I really wanted to stay. So I had to find a way to earn money there. And I wasn't an American, so I couldn't exactly go get a job in a supermarket. There were some other interesting people there that this woman knew, and kind of ladies' tea party type women. And they took me to a wet t-shirt contest at a go-go club in Waikiki. And everybody who entered this contest got a job as a server dancer in that club. We weren't strippers, we were server dancers. And I was maybe the only straight girl in the bunch, though. But we all worked for tips. And I worked very hard and saved all the money I earned, just save, 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 save. Eventually, I got tired of sitting on the beach with nothing going on really all day long. We just sat on the beach, and that night we put on false eyelashes and costumes and worked for tips in the club. Well, I got tired of that after, I don't know, about 8 months or something of doing that. And I'd accumulated quite a bit of money, and I wanted to get back to being an artist. I knew I didn't really belong in that genre, and I wanted to get back to being an artist. So I tried to get in the Master's Fine Arts program at the University of Hawaii, but that would mean I would be an international student, and the tuition was astronomical. So that was kind of, not the right thing. But I'd met a prof or two in the fine arts department there, because you have conversations with people like that when you're trying to get into a fine art, into a master's program. And this one prof said, well, why don't you just go to this Foundry Art Center place? There's a pottery studio there. You'd probably be able to get in there and do some work. And so I went there, and I found this falling down old building. And it had no real walls. It was all basically held together with chain link fence. And it's a wonderful thing to be a potter in Hawaii, because you're never cold, and your stuff is, leather hard in 25 minutes. You don't have to wait overnight. And anyway, it had a lot of different artists, this Foundry Art Center. It had a painter, really, really, really talented painter, a set designer, a sculptor, stained glass studio, and several independent potters. So it's all broken up into spaces, and people did their work there. There was also a really, really big space there called the Pottery Hui. Hui means club in Hawaiian. And so this was a group of potters who had straight jobs but wanted to still do pottery. And they would come there in the evenings or on the weekends to keep up their craft. And they were looking for a new manager. There was always somebody that had to be a manager there, because somebody had to keep the glaze buckets full and do various chores, fire the kiln and things like that. So when I wandered in, they said, hey, do you want to be the manager of the Hui? And I said, sure. And in exchange for managing all this stuff for them every day, I was given the privilege of using this studio, which had wheels and a kiln and everything you could hope to have. So let me get here, the next page. All the Hui potters were a really nice bunch of people. They all had great jobs, and they were good people. But I have to say that the other artists at the Foundry Art Center were quite a rarefied avant-garde bunch. And I was there all day, every day with them. And I soon got swept up in the activities going on behind the scenes with them. And namely, that was smoking crystal meth. So if you don't know this, crystal meth is speed, and it makes you feel really good. So as a depressive, I was a prime candidate. Eventually, the group replaced the meth with freebase, which is the old-fashioned name for what is now crack cocaine. So sessions of partaking in these drugs would last for several days. And fortunately for me, they eventually cut me off, because when the session was over and I came down, I couldn't handle. I would get really depressed, and they didn't really like having someone like that around. So now I couldn't get drugs anymore. And unfortunately, though, I still crave those drugs every minute of the day, endlessly. Now, here comes some good news. At the Foundry, there was also a sculptor named Monty Mansfield, and he was a Christian who kept himself in the studio doing bronze casting with his wife, Terry. And I have to tell you, Terry's here today watching me from California. Hi, Terry. So Monty had a decal in American English, on the back window of his pickup. It was a red circle with 666 in it in red and a line through it like a no smoking sign. And one day I asked him what it meant. And he explained all about the Antichrist and talked about how a person had an inner man and an outer man, and it was the inner man that communicated with God in the spirit. And he explained a lot of things to me. And then he asked if I would like to give my life to the Lord. And of course I said yes. I mean, I knew I'd already prayed this in his prayer, but I thought, well, can't hurt to do it again. So I did that with him. And he was vigilant to say to me that I needed to live this out, that I needed to keep in touch with God, and I needed to apply the gospel to my life. Well, of course, I didn't do any of that. I just continued to be a potter craving speed. So in the parable of the sower, that would be where the seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants so they didn't bear grain. Now, although I wasn't doing drugs, I was still roaming around in the wilderness, depressed and craving drugs. One day, a handsome stranger came to the foundry, and he sat around talking to me, and he kept visiting me, and we fell into a relationship. Dummy me. I ended up paying his rent and my rent. And when I could no longer pay both rents, he had me move in with him. He managed to use up all my money really fast, and then he told me to move out. He turned out to be a con artist. That was a terrible shock. And it wasn't really any worse than some of the other awful things I'd survived, but being conned was deeply humiliating, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. A deep depression was developing, and I was terrified. For the first time in my life, though, I tried to fend it off. And I constructed a psychological wall of defiance around myself. And I decided that life was a big, sick joke. I packed up all my possessions in wooden Chinese duck egg crates and stacked them in my studio space and crashed at one of the Hui Potter's places. And I held on to that thought, that tough wall of resistance to reality. I managed to hold that thought for several days. And then I went to my studio to do some work. And when I stepped inside the studio that day, I felt my protective wall crumbling away. It wasn't working anymore. And as I stood facing that chain link gate that I had just come through, I saw a faint mist floating toward me, just like a fog coming inland. And I knew it was depression, and it was coming fast, and I was terrified. Well, I picked up the phone. Of course, the phone was just a dial-up phone, and I picked it up and I dialed a woman named Mary Minch. Mary had been visiting my studio for a year or so every so often, and she really liked me. She'd come and get a hunk of clay or leave me something to fire for her, and we always had long talks. So Mary knew absolutely everything about me. She knew my whole life story. She knew what was happening to me at the moment. And to me, Mary was a rock. She always had a baby in her arms, and she always had a few toddlers trailing after her. So she had I think 8 or 9 children. She really, really liked me. And she even said she thought we were kindred spirits. Now, Mary was a born-again Christian. So back to the phone call, I dialed Mary. I'm terrified. Depression is about to choke me again. And she answered. And I said, Mary, everything has fallen apart again. And this time I can't put my life back together. And I'm falling into a deep depression. And Mary said, you've been nurturing people for a long time, Mary Lou, and it's time for you to be nurturing now. And I thought, okay. And she welcomed me to come and live at her house. But I was reluctant, being a loner. And Mary didn't push it because she knew I was a loner. And she understood that I might not be very comfortable around all those children and all that ruckus. So she said, Mary Lou, you need Christian fellowship. And I said, okay, Mary, okay, I'll get Christian fellowship. Meanwhile, I'm trembling and choking in depression. I said, I'll phone Monty, the Christian guy here at the Foundry, and I'll get Christian fellowship from him and his wife, Terry. So Mary said she would pray for the peace of God beyond all human understanding for me. She was going to help me with that depression. And that I was to call her back right after I had called Monty and Terry. So I called Monty and Terry, and Monty answered. I said, hello, Monty. This is Mary Lou, and I need Christian fellowship. That's all I said. And Monty replied that Waikiki Beach Chaplaincy was putting on a Christian concert at Alawana Park, and that he and Terry would swing by the Foundry and pick me up. So I hung up the phone, and the peace of God beyond human understanding fell on me, just embraced me, and the depression was gone. And I felt the presence of Jesus. And I called Mary and I told her. And Monty and Terry fetched me and took me to the concert. And I continued to be filled with peace and a feeling of safety for a very, very, very long time, 6 inches off the ground. And lo and behold, I realized something amazing. After a couple of days, it dawned on me that the craving for speed was gone. God had delivered me. I didn't even ask, and he delivered me. So, I'm going to skip a page here. I'm getting all mixed up. Right away, God placed in my life a missionary couple. You can see the discipleship starting to happen here. He placed in my life a missionary couple whose ministry it was to do Bible study with new Christians. I grew and I grew and I grew and I grew. I was so on fire for the Lord that, like Monty and other people around me said, that I was an inspiration to other Christians. Finally, the seed had fallen on good soil, and I was growing up, and I was increasing in Jesus. I was baptized in the surf at Waikiki Beach, and I became a member of the little church that Terry and Monty went to, and that was called Evangelical Christian Church, ECC. Wonderful little fellowship, very much like Gabriola Fellowship Church. And I was nurtured there, and I learned more and more about God and the Holy Spirit, and there was really great Bible study. And so, as you can see, discipleship was occurring all around me in my life. Another part, a very important part of my discipleship, was that every morning at the Foundry Arts Center, Monty and another Christian artist in a studio down the street would come and fetch me in the Hui and bring me back to Monty's studio, where he had an office in a loft that he had built. I'm telling you, Monty built everything to last for eternity. He built fabulous stuff. And so we would go up to this really neat loft that he had built where he kept his office things. And we would sit on a rug and pray. And they were teaching me to pray. That was the mission, teach Mary Lou to pray. So one day they suggested that I ask God for something. And I had wanted to get a bicycle, but it had to be cheap because I didn't have an awful lot of money back then after all that. And so they said I should pray for something. And so I said, well, okay, I'll pray for a bicycle. And they said, well, God likes us to be specific in prayer. And so I kind of scratched my head, and they said, well, what color of a bicycle would you like? And I thought for a minute. I said, well, white would be nice. So we prayed for a white bicycle for me. And I went back to my work in the Hui. And then, like, we all used to go visit this guy in this shop called the Bamboo Barn around the corner. It was just a really cool shop with a lot of, he had a lot of bamboo stuff and baskets and all kinds of things. And he was a really nice man. And he had succulent plants, and we used to give him our old useless pots, and he'd plant succulents in them and stuff. And he liked the potters. And so I decided to go around there for coffee that afternoon. So I went over there, and Bob and I were chatting over coffee, and I told him I was looking for a secondhand bicycle. And I wondered if he could give me any advice about where I could find something like that. And he suggested, well, you could look in the classified ads in the paper. And I thought, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I'll try that. And I think he also suggested that I could see if there were any bicycle shops that had secondhand bikes. So I had some ideas then, and I thought, okay. Then we finished our coffee, and I was just gathering myself up to leave. And he said, hey, wait a minute. I think I might still have my old bicycle up in the attic. So we went up to the attic where his extra merchandise was stored, and lo and behold, there was a white 10-speed bike leaning against a pile of boxes. And he sold it to me for $20. I was telling everybody, God gave me a white bicycle. I asked for it, and God gave it to me. It was wonderful. It was such confirmation of God's love for me. It was a small thing, but it was, many people probably thought I was nuts, but it meant so much to me. And I guess that's as far as I'm going to take you today in my story. At that point, I was 33 years old. And as I said, I was saved by the grace of God when I was 8 years old. And it took me 25 years to get to being a disciple of Jesus Christ. I'm 73 now. But this is as far as I'm going to take you today. There are lots more adventures between 33 and 73. Maybe I'll share some of those with you someday. But today, I just pray that someone here has been blessed by my story. And this is a Bible verse that I'd like to share with you. It's Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. And that's where I am today. And I thank you for listening to my story. And I hope that if there's anybody out there who has really not done that, really not accepted Jesus' perfect, beautiful, free gift of salvation, and you just haven't done it yet, there's lots of people in that room with you today that can talk to you and help you with that. And I pray that if there's somebody there that hasn't done that yet, that they'll get into a conversation with somebody and be blessed as richly and deeply as I have been blessed.